Obviously, people from Africa aren't black. I really don't understand why some people think that Egyptians aren't and weren't black. I mean, look today in southern Egypt and even in central Egypt, in every part of Egypt, there is black people. The ties linking Egyptians to their African roots are undeniable. Even the hieroglyphics have dark-skinned people painted on them, and people of my skin tone and every other skin tone. You have to ask yourself, if those people were really white, Asian, Muslim, why couldn't they draw the people lighter? I mean, obviously, because they were black. In Greek hieroglyphics, you can also see they had the ability to draw the people as their own skin tone. You see people in Greek hieroglyphics with tan skin and white skin. So obviously the Egyptians had the material if they wanted to draw themselves accurately. Thus, that means since they drew themselves with dark skin, they definitely had dark skin. Some people justify saying Egyptians weren't black because Egyptians have documents that said that they captured Nubians as slaves, and they painted the Nubians as darker Africans. Well, this makes sense because as you start to get into South Africa and Central Africa, skin tones do get darker. If you think about it, features of African people are just like features of European people. As you go north, facial features get more generic looking and skin tones get lighter. As you go east, skin tones get a little bit darker and looks get more exotic. And as you go south, skin tones get darker. Africa and Europe mimic each other, so why would people ever think that Egyptians aren't African just because they have different facial characteristics? So saying that the Nubians were actually African while the Egyptians weren't is a totally false statement. People in Africa have varying skin tones just like Europeans. It doesn't mean that they're not African, it means that they just have a different skin tone. That's like saying Italians aren't white, or Greeks aren't white, or Bulgarians aren't white. One of the also undeniable ties that ties Egyptians to black people and their African roots is because Egyptians worshipped black gods. In ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, you can see that most of their gods are black or dark skinned. This is because the Egyptians were black and they worshiped people like them, and especially gods like them. Usually, white people do not like to worship gods of another race. Most people tend to worship gods that have the same skin color as them, and they make up in their mind that their god is the same skin color as them. This can be seen in the Western world and in ancient civilizations like ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, you can see that their gods like Zeus and Poseidon were white gods. And you can see even in the Western world today that many white people tend to think Jesus is white and also that God is white. It's a natural thing to worship gods and make up a picture in your mind that the gods are the same race as you. So Egyptians depicting gods as dark skinned and African definitely ties them and shows that Egyptians were black people and they worship gods and people like them. Also, one of the most obvious ties that Egyptians were black people is because they did things that black people do nowadays. Egyptians were some of the first people to use hair pieces, and they used this specifically because it was documented they used hair pieces to protect their natural hair from the sun. This is exactly what African Americans and black people all across the world do today. They use hair pieces because our hair breaks off easily in the sun, and because they help the hair that we do have, the natural hair, grow. Egyptians also use oils. Black people know that oils are really good for skin, mostly because our skin dries out in the sun. And also because regular lotions that Caucasians, Asians, and Middle Easterners use wouldn't necessarily work as well on our skin. It can be more easily understood if I can relate Egypt to America. Just like America, the white settlers came in and wiped out most of the Native Americans. But does that mean the original people of the Americas weren't Native American and they're actually white? No, it doesn't. Just like Egypt. Egypt was invaded by Arabs. and is mostly taken over by Arabs today. But does it mean that there still aren't any true black people in Egypt or any Africans in Egypt? No, they're still there. And they still were the first people in Egypt, and they were the ancient Egyptians. It's good to clear up that many people around the world do not think of black the same way Westerners do. So of course people in Egypt who have grown up speaking Arabic and who practice Middle Eastern customs wouldn't classify themselves as black even if they really were. Clearly the ties of black people to ancient Egypt and vice versa are very clear. Ancient Egyptians were black, and they still are today. Some people in Egypt are technically of Middle Eastern descent, but definitely not all of them. There was race mixing between Greeks and Egyptians, which are black people, but then again, that was very little people, and that was around the time Cleopatra was in control. With that said, Egyptians were actually black and still are today. And Egypt, being in Africa, is an African country. At the end of the day, the links tying Egyptians to their African roots is undeniable. But I just have to say, if it makes you feel better to just think Egyptians were Middle Eastern, white, or Asians, go ahead. It's your life and whatever floats your boat. But history is what really backs up the facts that Egyptians were African, and you cannot deny history.